Hi, everyone. So you've heard from Paul about the makeup of government and Parliament and also about the core functions of Parliament. I'm going to focus on two of those functions, how Parliament holds the government to account and how laws are made. The UK is a parliamentary democracy, and within our democratic system, Parliament is sovereign. This principle of parliamentary sovereignty means Parliament is the supreme legal authority in the UK. Parliament can create any law and it can end any law. Generally, the courts cannot overrule its laws, and no parliament can pass laws that future parliaments cannot change. This means that the government cannot change laws without Parliament's agreement. Parliamentary approval is required in some form or another for any change to the law. And it's not just in relation to lawmaking that government is accountable to Parliament. Parliament examines and challenges the work of the government in many different ways, and this is often referred to as scrutiny. So I'm going to start with the methods of scrutiny that allow Parliament to hold the government to account, and then I'll move on to the specific issue of lawmaking and how that works. Scrutiny in both houses of Parliament can take place either in a plenary setting, that is in the chambers of each house, where you see the green benches in the Commons or the red benches in the Lords, or it can take place in a committee setting outside of the chambers. In the chambers, there's a regular rhythm to the organisation of business. Most days begin with question time, and you may have seen Prime Minister's questions before. These take place every Wednesday lunchtime, but it isn't just the Prime Minister that answers questions. Questions to government ministers from all departments are a key feature of the parliamentary day, and there is an essential way in which MPs and peers can hold the government to account for its policies and decisions. These other question times tend to be far more calm than the weekly knockabout session with the Prime Minister. In addition to these oral questions each day in the chamber, members of Parliament can also send written questions directly to departments for a response. Question time in the chamber is a planned event, so ministers can arrive well prepared. But sometimes, if an important matter has arisen, the government might be required to send a minister in at very short notice, perhaps only an hour or two, to answer questions on an urgent issue. In addition to questions, ministers can also proactively come to Parliament to make statements on their policies and decisions. And when a minister finishes making a statement in Parliament, members of Parliament are able to ask questions about that statement, so the government can again be held to account and asked to justify its position on an issue. And the chambers are also the main location in which debates of different kinds take place. Outside the chamber, scrutiny also takes place in committees known as select committees. Select committees are made up of backbenchers, and their role is to carry out more detailed investigative work on specific policy issues. In the Commons, there's usually one select committee for each government department, and in the Lords, committees tend to cut across government boundaries, government departmental boundaries. These committees often run inquiries, and an inquiry involves issuing an open call for views on a policy issue. Experts like academics, charities, businesses, and members of the public will usually respond by offering evidence to the committee. And the committee will then invite some of them to attend public meetings to explore the issues further. The committee will also question the relevant government minister in a public session. After that, the committee will publish a report on the issue, setting out what recommendations it wants the government to adopt. So that covers holding the government to account, or scrutiny, as I've described it. And some key questions arising include, how much should government be able to do without informing or engaging with Parliament and its committees? Should Parliament always be informed in advance on important announcements? That's certainly something the current Speaker of the House of Commons feels very strongly about. And are there exceptions, or should Parliament always be the first place where announcements are made? So I want to move on now to the subject of lawmaking and legislation and say a little bit about the legislative process. Legislation is essentially a law or a set of laws that have been passed by Parliament. The word is also used to describe the act of making a new law. The first thing to say is that there are two broad categories of legislation: primary legislation and secondary legislation. Primary legislation covers the main laws passed by Parliament. These start out life as bills, and once they've passed through the various stages of the legislative process, they become acts of Parliament. Secondary legislation, on the other hand, does not go through that full legislative process. It covers laws that are made by government ministers or by other bodies under powers that are given to those individuals by an Act of Parliament. Because the opportunities to scrutinise secondary legislation are much more limited than those for primary legislation, the power to make new laws in this way is usually quite constrained. So secondary legislation is used for things like filling out the detail of an act, flexibly updating the law to react to new events, or responding to urgent situations. So let's go back now to primary legislation and what the full legislative process looks like. A bill is introduced in Parliament by a government minister. It's published online with various supporting documents to help explain what the change in law will do if it's passed. The first opportunity MPs have to debate the bill and ask questions about it is during the second reading stage. This is typically a full day's debate in the chamber, focused on the principles of what the new law is trying to achieve. After this, there's a more detailed discussion about the bill. This typically takes place in a bill committee, but can also take place in the chamber. Either way, this stage is known as committee stage, and it's a line-by-line consideration of the bill. It's at this stage that MPs in the committee can propose changes to the bill in the form of amendments. And in putting forward these changes, MPs will be informed by the views of others, including academics and other experts, pressure groups, and of course their own constituents. Any decisions on changes to the bill can be taken unanimously or by majority vote in the committee. There's then a further opportunity for all MPs to propose changes at report stage, which takes place in the chamber. Again, decisions on changes can be taken unanimously or by majority vote. And given that the government has a majority in the Commons, you would usually only see changes pass if they have government support. Report stage is followed immediately by a third reading debate, which allows one final discussion of the whole bill after changes in earlier stages have been made. That concludes the process in one house, and the bill then passes to the other house, in this case the House of Lords, and goes through a similar process there. Both houses must ultimately agree the identical text. So if changes are made in one house but not the other, they will pass it backwards and forwards in a stage sometimes referred to as ping pong until agreement is reached. As the House of Commons is the directly elected chamber, the Lords typically doesn't block whole bills, and in certain circumstances, the Commons can refuse changes put forward by the Lords. But normally compromise is reached, and the agreed text becomes an Act of Parliament. While most Acts of Parliament arise from bills initiated by government, there are numerous attempts by backbenchers to introduce bills and try to pass them through Parliament. These backbench bills are known as private members' bills. However, with the government in control of time in the chamber and with the majority it holds in the Commons, passing a private member's bill through all of these stages and turning it into law is virtually impossible without government support. So that's a quick whiz through how laws are made, and some interesting questions for you to start thinking about include: how much should the government be able to legislate on its own? How much do we want Parliament to constrain or influence the making of laws? And should Parliament be able to more easily initiate and pass its own laws? Thank you.